Okay, I think you're going to find I have sort of a covert Southern accent, but I consider that a compliment from Skip. So I always love being at this wonderful presidential center, and as Skip mentioned, I have a very special connection to this state, but I especially am excited to be here today during Women's History Month. We're going to talk about some amazing women who I think are making history, along with a few very good men. But I had the privilege of talking to the students at lunch, and I see in them history makers in the making, and that for me is always very exciting. So I want to talk. We're going to talk about a lot today. We're going to start with talking about radicalism, new rules for radicals, how storytellers, opinion shapers, and subversives, my favorite word, are changing the movement to end gender-based violence. And you're going to meet some quite amazing people today. But I want to start, before I share stories, I like to start with statistics. And it's important as you listen to what I have to say today and meet some of these really quite impressive people to understand the scope and scale of the issue we're talking about, that every story you hear and see today is a window into a world where millions of people live through violence. 1 in 3 women across the globe will experience some form of rape or physical abuse, trafficking, interpersonal violence, forced marriage. 1 in 5 U.S. women will be raped during her lifetime, and 1 in 6 boys will be a victim of sexual violence before the age of 18. So a huge human rights and social justice issue, a huge public health issue, because when you have figures like that, we are losing lives, we are losing creativity, we are losing families, and we have to stop that. But before we dive into those stories, as I promised in the lecture description promised, we're going to talk about one of my own personal heroes, and for me, in some ways, ground zero for the work that I do. And that is the extraordinary author and community organizer, really seen as the father of community organization, Saul Alinsky. I don't know who knows about him, how many of you know about him in this audience. I hope the students in here absolutely read the book, Rules for Radicals. But he has been an inspiration to Secretary of State Clinton. She actually wrote her honors thesis about Alinsky. Our president started his career as a community organizer in my hometown of Chicago, working with Alinsky methods. And interestingly, I saw an ad today for Senator Sanders, and he was arrested roughly at the time that Alinsky was working on these issues at the University of Chicago for trying to segregate a school. Now, on the right end of the spectrum, desegregate a school. On the right end of the spectrum, no one other than William F. Buckley has praised this man as an organizational genius. I think that was begrudging praise because clearly Saul Alinsky is a leftist radical. But what it says is that his principles are extraordinary and brilliant, and that this is an organizer we can learn from. Now, I do hope you get his book, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, kind of a summary of what I walked away with. And it was interesting for me to reread the book recently and realize how much these qualities characterize the best members of the movement to end gender-based violence. Ease people into change. And then a quote from the book, men don't like to step out of the security of familiar experience. They need a bridge to cross from their own experience to a new way. And we're going to talk in a minute about bridge builders. Communicate clearly. Cannot be more important if you're an activist. It doesn't matter what you know about anything if you cannot communicate. In that event, you are not even a failure. You are just not there. Get comfortable with conflict. Change means movement. Movement means friction. And we'll talk about that. And then finally, get results. And this, I think, is something that clearly the former Secretary of State Clinton believes deeply. Be a realistic radical, not a rhetorical one. That we think and believe, and we also act in ways that create change. So, my own new rule, since we're talking about new rules for radicals, In the movement to end gender-based violence, it's not just about how, it's also about who. I've spent the last decade listening and learning from activists in the US and across the globe, and the ones that have been most effective, interestingly, seem to fall into three categories. Storytellers, and you're going to listen to the stories of some amazing storytellers today who use their personal testimonies to bring us closer to political truths. Someone who comes in the room and says, this is what I've gone through and how it affected me. But let me talk to you about my experience in a way that gets you to consider how it's affecting other people. Opinion shapers, I define them as leaders of or drivers of opinion within an organization or a community. Now that might be an official leader, it might be a rabbi, it might be a minister, it might be a community leader that's defined as a community leader. It may be a policymaker, but it also can be an unofficial leader. We've all been in groups where there's someone who is an opinion shaper, someone who, when they speak or they talk, people listen. Those folks are extraordinarily powerful, and you're going to meet some of them today. And finally, subversives. And I would argue, for me, subversion is one of the most beautiful words in the English language. It means that you seek to upend or overthrow an established order, working from within or outside of the system. Subversion can be nonviolent. Subversion, to my mind, the best subversive activities are peaceful. But what it means is when we see injustice, we can't continually say, how can I work around or within this? Sometimes we have to say, we need to stop it. And that's, you're going to see some storytellers who have done that. So we are going to listen to some stories that I hope will move and open your hearts. But why, as a strategy, do stories matter? Why are stories so compelling and effective? Why at the Voices and Faces Project, which is the organization with which I'm affiliated, are we so passionate about stories? First of all, when you're talking about gender-based violence, stories put names and faces on issues that often render victims silent and invisible. They remind us that every social injustice has a human cost. They show the cost of violence over the short term and over time, meaning very often when the media covers a story, when someone's lived through violence, we understand and it's covered in the first few weeks and months. But violence doesn't live that way in the life of a survivor. If you've survived gender-based violence, it will change your life over time. It doesn't mean you can't have a full and rich life. It does mean that it is a lifetime, passionate struggle that does not go away. And stories remind us of that. Another reason, I think for me, when I started the Voices and Faces Project, and when I began work on Live Through This, my book, part of what I realized later I was really seeking were stories of survivors, other survivors, because I myself am a survivor of violence, stories that gave me a sense of hope, stories that showed me that I was not alone, stories that actually said to me, this person made it through, and you can too. And those are some of the stories you'll hear today. And finally, and I think this is critical, stories break through ideological barriers. There is a growing body of incredibly important research that shows that the best indicator of how someone will vote on an issue or feel about an issue isn't always their political identification. It isn't whether they're on the left or the right end of the spectrum. It can be whether they've been exposed to the right stories. Stories are how we construct our values, and when we read or we hear stories, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, and show you a very specific story that speaks to that, we can break through ideological barriers in ways that are quite extraordinary. And finally, for me, without stories, we understand issues and we think, but we don't always feel. Stories force us to move through that space, that place where we try to remain removed from people's pain, and stories take us closer to people's pain. And that is their inherent power. So I want to start by taking you to South Africa, a trip I took 2 years ago, really one of the most inspiring groups of women I've worked with over the course of my career as an activist, a group of women who now call themselves the Voices and Faces Project of South Africa. But it's a community of women in Durban, South Africa, survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, trafficking, interpersonal violence, who recognize that in this extraordinary country where a community of leaders in the African National Congress, in the Anglican Church, religious leaders, had fought and won to dismantle the system of apartheid. And they had done that successfully. And yet still in this country, for very complex reasons, violence against women is at some of the highest rates in the world, particularly interpersonal violence. Many of the women would talk about how hard it was for them to come forward to the police if they had been victims of violence because of generations of the police not listening and not working with or supporting women of color. These women also talked about how hard it was to see the men in their families and communities who had been discriminated against, who had suffered under apartheid, who had lived through violence, and sometimes were bringing that violence into their homes, how hard it was for these women to stand up against that. And a community of activists in South Africa came together and said, what if we bring these stories to the leaders in the government, to the leaders in the Anglican Church who effectively changed the course of history and said, you did this for Black South Africans, now you have to do it for all women. And the Voices and Faces Project and Tear Fund, which is one of the largest NGOs, non-governmental organizations in the world, working to connect communities of faith to communities at risk. So basically they work in the 40 most endangered countries in the world. Tear Fund came to the Voices and Faces Project and said, we know we have an issue in South Africa. We have a community that wants to come forward. None of these women have ever spoken publicly about their experiences. Would you join with us to help them think about how to share their stories? And so we traveled to South Africa and spent 10 days in South Africa with these women, brought many of the exercises and programs that the Voices and Faces Project brings to survivors in the US with our writing workshop, and helped them think through what they wanted to say. Simultaneously, Tear Fund worked to get major leaders from the South African government, along with major leaders from the Anglican Church. And to give you context for the Anglican Church, this is, of course, the church that has been led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Nobel laureate. And in fact, one of the first South African female bishops was in attendance at this meeting, Bishop Margaret. And the women came in the room and they shared their stories, but they decided to open the story in a way that was absolutely unique to them. One of the things our Voices and Faces Project team asked them as we were preparing was to share one statement about how the violence they had lived through had hurt them, and one statement of hope about where they wanted the country to go. And they wrote these statements on signs, and they walked in this room with these major leaders from across South Africa. Again, women who had never publicly, all of them, I believe, had never publicly spoken, period. None of them had shared stories of violence. And they held signs as they sang beautifully, and there's such beautiful music if you spend time in South Africa, while they sang beautifully and softly the song Kumbaya. And they held signs that said things like, my husband was my rapist and no one cared. Everyone knew. A second sign said, everyone knew, no one spoke. A third said, I went to the police for help and I was assaulted again. powerful statements like that. But on the flip side, and one other thing they did was quite remarkable, they each wrote their own signs, but they each decided to carry another woman's sign because they wanted to be a messenger for one another. And then they turned those signs over, and on the back they had statements of hope. I want to be a voice for the voiceless. The world wants me to be silent, but I will speak. I am a voice and face that matters. And I looked out in this audience, you know, when these leaders, these governmental and religious leaders walked in, I think we were all intimidated. I felt somewhat intimidated. And I looked out into this audience as these women sang that song and showed those signs and then came forward to speak. And I did not see a dry eye in that room. One of the other quite remarkable things about seeing these women over the course of 10 days, and I wish I could share with you the photos. This was one of the photos taken at the end. If you saw the photos of Fakile and Yvette taken at the beginning, they were very different people. Their body language, their affect, their ability to look people in the eye. And that was because they reclaimed their power, they used their voices, and they were, thanks to Tear Fund and to my wonderful colleagues at the Voices and Faces Project, they were in a space of love and hope. Now, they are the storytellers and they are the heroes and stars. And there were several other women who were part of this project. You can see some of their photos on our website. But there was also an opinion shaper who made this possible. And that's Vina O'Sullivan, who heads up Tear Fund's work focused on HIV and sexual violence. And and this is actually in one of the meetings when we were all together and Vina was listening to the women strategize on what they wanted to do. But part of Vina's brilliance and genius is that she said, we have women who want to share a story and they're compelling. We need to get the right people in the room to hear these women. And it was Vina who used all the power and influence of Tear Fund, this international NGO, to compel leaders from South Africa to be in that room. It was Vina who went to the Anglican Church, who went to Bishop Margaret, who went to major religious leaders and said, we must do better, and you need to hear from these women to know why. Now, very often, we like to think that moments of testimony are spontaneous. I was rereading, as I worked on Live Through This, the story of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on that bus, an event that, of course, many see as the beginning of the modern-day civil rights movement. What's fascinating about that is history often likes to see that as a spontaneous gesture. It was a courageous and heroic and amazing gesture, but in fact, it was a gesture that for a very long time, the NAACP and Rosa Parks had talked about the importance of someone standing up in this way, had talked to Rosa Parks about what it might mean for her to stand up in this way, what the risks were. It's a perfect example of a heroic and heartfelt and real gesture meeting real strategy. The NAACP knew that this movement needed a face and a voice, and Rosa Parks had the courage and the belief to be that face and voice. I think what that tells us is not only can strategy and ideology coexist, strategy and ideology must in some cases coexist. Preparation is key. We can't ask women or men, we cannot ask survivors of violence to walk in a room and speak out if we don't help them think through what that means and what that might look like. A lot of what we did in the 10 days leading up to these women in South Africa speaking was say to them, this is what this might feel like. This is what it can mean for your family. This is what you might be asked. We had a moral obligation to do that. So preparation is key. And finally, I see this over and over and over again in my work. Collaboration with faith-based groups is powerful, and that there are allies in these groups that can change everything for us. As a little fascinating aside, Tear Fund is a large, major evangelical NGO. Our Voices and Faces Project traveling team was made up of a devout Jew, a Buddhist, and myself, a Methodist. And the three of us, along with this beautiful, beautiful group of allies at Tear Fund, worked together on this program. The day the women presented, Margaret Fatou, who as I mentioned, was one of the two first women to be made a bishop in the country of South Africa by Desmond Tutu. Margaret Fatou had heard about this Voices and Faces team, and she walked up to the three of us, the Jew, the Buddhist, and the Methodist, and she said, the Trinity. And it was a really lovely moment because she'd been hearing about the work that we were doing with the folks at Tear Fund. She, by the way, is a remarkable force in and of herself. So it's particularly nice to be here during Women's History Month and tell the stories of people like Vina and Bishop Tutu, and of course, Fikele and Yvette and this community of South African women. They changed the lives of women that day. They changed my life. I came out of South Africa so excited about what I had seen, so excited to be more of what they were, frankly. Marina Nemat is a writer, the author of a memoir I hope you will read, called Prisoner of Tehran. She is also a survivor of rape and torture. She was held in Evin prison in Tehran, a notorious prison. It is still a prison that is open. And she was held there between the age of 16 and 18 in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. And she was held because she spoke out against the government at that time. And while she was held there, and thousands of children, by the way, and you can read about this in her book, thousands of children were held in the same way in a prison that is really ground zero for some of the most horrific torture that we've known across the globe. She survived that rape and torture. She got out of the prison. She came to Canada with her family, and she didn't really talk about the rape she had lived through for 17 years. And that was when I mentioned earlier that violence plays out sometimes over time. That was when she began to struggle. She couldn't sleep. She was having flashbacks. And she took to paper and pen and began to write her story, a memoir that now has been translated, I believe, into 28 languages. But what Marina has become in the wake of publishing that book is one of the most outspoken, not only anti-violence advocates in the world, but one of the most outspoken voices against torture. Voices against torture in any way, in any place. She will say very loudly and very clearly, not only does torture not work, it is immoral, it cannot be justified, that there is no war, that there is no battle, there is no place for torture in a civilized society. Now, I watched her make this case in one of the most surprising and important venues you could make that case. It was 2012. It was during the presidential election. It was at a time when then Governor Romney was calling for what he called a double Guantanamo, where many people, largely on the right, but people in fairness across the spectrum, were speculating whether there were cases where torture was okay. And I watched Marina walk into a room in the Orange County, California area, a luncheon called Stand Up for Women, which was organized by Fairbanks Republican Women Federated, which is one of the largest and most powerful Republican women's groups in the country. There's a joke people tell about Orange County because it is indeed one of the most conservative countries in the county. Orange County is where good Republicans go to die, that it's heaven for someone on the right end of the spectrum. Presumably, and I was in that room, there were many lovely people. I think there were many lovely people in that room who may also have been more sympathetic to the arguments being made by those who were arguing for enhanced interrogation than many of us in this room might be. But Marina got up, and she did something that moved me deeply. She got up to talk to the audience about her experience. And the first thing she talked about was growing up, how she loved books, that in fact, in the wake of the revolution, one of the hardest things for her to lose were her books, because she loved reading. And one of the books she most loved was Little House on the Prairie. And she talked about her love of America and American books and her ideas about America and what America was. And then she moved into talking about her experience with torture and what she lived through and what it taught her and why it showed her that torture was not only wrong, it was ineffective. And at the end of this speech, organized by these Republican women, and I'm going to talk specifically about one woman who's at the heart of this important luncheon, Marina received a standing ovation. That says something about the power of stories to break through ideological barriers. Now, Marina is the storyteller. I want to say something to you about how she uses language, and then I want to talk to you about the opinion shaper who made it possible for Marina to be in that room. Marina used her story, she used her words, she used her language to bridge divides. I was recently rereading Reverend King's I Have a Dream speech. I was also rereading his letter from a Birmingham jail, both of which are wonderful documents that teach us much about language. But one of the things that I found fascinating is that the word he uses over and over again in I Have a Dream is freedom. He chose the word freedom instead of equality, and historians have speculated that that was because freedom was a word that resonated more broadly with the American public. And that I happen to think both words are absolutely necessary, very, very important words, that equality is something we have to fight for vigorously. But he chose freedom, presumably, because that was a word that opened doors. And I think we can learn from that. There are two interesting economists, Jesse Shapiro and Matthew Jenschow, who have done some really interesting work on how language cues ideology. So if I come in the room and I use the language I'm comfortable with, and I talk about my feminism, and I talk about the patriarchy, and I talk in the language that I'll use when I'm talking with my allies and friends, that is going to open certain doors. But if I co-opt language that sometimes is associated with folks perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, family values, moral values, if I talk about the damage done to the family when gender-based violence is tolerated, if I use that language to convey my message, I can create a space where people want to hear and learn. Now, I'm not advocating for any particular set of words. What I am advocating for is think about your audience and think about what will resonate for them. Never be untrue to your principles. Never go in a room and don't use words or don't speak to ideas you don't believe deeply in. But think about language strategically, because it really is the first step toward meeting people where they are. Now, getting back to Marina being in this room and speaking so eloquently about torture. Stephanie Hansen is a human rights activist who has done really important work. She's worked very closely with Witness, which is a terrific organization that arms people across the globe with video cameras so they can record human rights violations. She is also a moderate Republican who was, in fact, the person who organized that luncheon I just told you about. And she's someone who has fought hard within her community to say, gender-based violence, human rights, a message of anti-torture, we need that in the Republican Party. We need that in both parties. And one of the things she said to me that day that I found very striking when I talked to her about this luncheon, she said, I can argue over and over about the facts and the data related to torture or rape or other human rights violations. Or I can open the door in my community and ask Marina Nemat to step in the room. And she can change everything. We're all members of communities. We all have heard stories that matter, and we all know communities that should hear and will be open to hearing those stories. That's what Stephanie did. That's how change happens. Roger Canoff is a former Assistant Attorney General of New York who I knew for many, many years as a really great prosecutor of sex crimes, child abuse, and elder abuse. I knew him also to be very sympathetic, a great ally to the movement to end gender-based violence. And 2 or 3 years ago, as I was finishing up my book, Live Through This, he pulled me aside and said, Anne, I haven't really talked about this publicly, but I am a survivor of childhood sexual violence. And I want to come forward and share my story in your book. And he said to me, I've spent years in courtrooms prosecuting these cases, saying to judges and juries, I am here to speak for these victims. And then he said, I want to have the courage and the strength to say, I am speaking with and standing with them. And that was why he came forward. I'm a big believer that a bigger tent makes a better movement. We've always known men can be critical allies to the movement to end gender-based violence. What we are seeing more and more, certainly, as I watched the film Spotlight about the priest abuse scandal and the violence so many grown men experienced as boys, as I listened to those stories, I realized, again, anew, I should say, that men aren't just allies. They have a critical personal stake in this movement, and we need to welcome them. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who's an artist. He creates some really important murals that address economic inequality, that address gun violence. He's an artist based in Chicago. He's had what I find to be surprising success getting these murals up in city parks and on buildings the city has a stake in. Given the fact that police brutality in my city, violence, gun violence are both pressing issues, and sometimes institutions can be hesitant about addressing and taking that on. And I said to him, how do you keep getting your art in these spaces? How are you doing this? And he said, you know what, Anne? In any organization, the trick is there are, and I'll never forget the phrase, secret good people. There are people who are working within systems and are so sympathetic to what you're doing. There are people sometimes who are in the police force, seeing the police brutality and saying, I don't want this to be the way it is. They are people in the church saying, I'm recognizing that there's violence here, and I'm not sure what to do to address it, but I'm going to open the door to a journalist that can help. Secret good people are one of our great secret weapons. So find them, cultivate them, and then see what happens. Christine de Stryver, I think you can see from the photo just what a beautiful force this woman is. And I met her in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with gender-based violence in that country. It has been called the rape capital of the world. It is a place where a confluence of events, a huge, long history of civil warfare, exploitation by those in the West, conflict minerals. A long history has made women vulnerable to sexual violence, and the sexual violence and the violence against women that occurs in Congo, it's hard to describe it except to say that very few women you encounter who have been raped there have been raped only once, The rapes that women have survived have often left them so physically damaged that there is a hospital and a doctor, Dr. Dennis Mukwege, whose entire practice is helping physically heal women and girls and children who have been raped so brutally that they sometimes can't move or walk. And in that country, a country Christine grew up in, she has a very unique story. She has a Congolese mother. Her father was from Belgium. He was a colonizer. She grew up as a mixed-race woman and lost her closest friend during that conflict. Her friend was raped, tortured, and murdered. A few years later, she held a child in her arms who had been raped and died of those wounds. And Christine became, and now is, one of the most powerful voices for women and girls in that country. And she is the director of a place called City of Joy, which is really a transformative community for women. It grew out of this recognition that women and girls who survive violence have lived through something terrible, but they still are, or still have the potential to be, extraordinary forces. Christine actually met Eve Ensler, who's the founder of V-Day, through Dr. Mukwege. And when Eve came to the country and they sat down with women, they listened and they learned and they decided to act to engage the world. So V-Day and UNICEF and a large community of international funders came together to say, women in Congo are telling us what they need. They need a community that's safe. They need a community where they can be educated. They need a community where they can heal and grow. They need a community, and this is the essence. When I came to City of Joy, those of us who hear or read about Congo, we read the heartbreaking facts, and we understand why we need to be fighting for justice for women in this region. When you come into that region, you recognize in this community that they're not just fighting for justice, they're fighting for joy. And you walk into the walls of City of Joy, and it is joyful. There are women singing. It is lush. It is verdant. There is song. There is dance. There are girls going to school and learning for the first time about their rights. They're healing. Their bodies have been healed most often by the time they get to City of Joy, thanks to the Panzi Hospital, which is up the road where Dr. Mukwege operates on women. But their spirits still need healing. And they're healing the mind and body at City of Joy. But they're doing something really interesting. And I think the most important thing they're doing is this. They're creating leaders. It is a leadership academy where women and girls enter in and find their own power. And instead of staying in this space, and it's hard to imagine, when I was there, I almost didn't want to leave this space. City of Joy is so wonderful. And V World Farm, which is a 300-acre farm where they're now creating a sustainable world, a just and economically sound world, I should add. But those women and girls, you would think they'd say, after all of the violence they've experienced in their own communities, I don't want to leave here. I don't want to go back. Every woman and girl I met there couldn't wait to go back to their own community to show this is who I've become, and let me work with you to bring us all forward. They want to go back to their communities. They want to leave this beautiful, safe space to go back out into the world and create change. That, for me, was also instructive. That's what it means to fight for justice and joy. We want justice and joy for ourselves, but we want it for our sisters. And these women and girls, and you can see in that photo the power, the force, and the joy. That is the essence of City of Joy. I have to say also that I think at its heart, it shows you how a series of conversations, Christine, Dr. Mukwege, Eve Ensler, a series of conversations, open doors. And when they came together with these remarkable women and listened to those women, this became not only a powerful local movement, it now is a global movement. And these women stand as examples of that. Jaclyn Friedman is the founder of Women Action in Media. I was talking last night to some of the students at the school about the power of social media, that open question of whether social media has done more good or has been most often a force for ill. We could debate that endlessly, but I want to talk about one terrific case where Jaclyn and two other wonderful activist groups, her group WHAM and two other groups and leaders, really subverted. They became powerful subversive force. They recognized, and I didn't know this myself till a few years ago, that Facebook had in place policies to deal with racist speech, racist posts on Facebook pages. They had in place policies to deal with anti-Semitic speech. They had in place no policies to deal with rape jokes, with misogynist hate speech. So in a certain sense, Facebook was a space where you could say anything you wanted about women. There was no policy in place that said we have to look at anti-woman hate speech the same way that we look at anti-Semitism or we look at racism on Facebook pages. We have to have zero tolerance. And so the brilliance of this particular action was Jaclyn and her two allies and the large group of groups she was working with said, let's use Facebook and Twitter and social media broadly to bring awareness to people about Facebook and what Facebook's tolerating. Let's create a campaign that uses social media to demand that Facebook change. So they set in motion this campaign, and its results were quite stunning. Facebook received over 5,000 emails saying, you need a policy. We can't tolerate this. It shouldn't be unsafe for my daughter to be on Facebook. 60,000 people posted on Twitter about Facebook and the need for Facebook to get it right when it came to anti-woman speech. Over a dozen companies, including Nissan, threatened to pull ads from the site if Facebook didn't address this. Now, all of that added up to a new Facebook policy. Facebook changed its policies. It said, we will not tolerate this, that we're going to take racism seriously, anti-Semitism seriously, and misogyny seriously. A huge win. I like to say, when it comes to dealing with corporations, the bottom line is the bottom line. There may be secret good people in those corporations. Many of us have worked in the private sector. Perhaps we were or are those secret good people. But if you want a corporation to change, you make it economically and socially impossible for them not to. It's that simple. And in this social media era, there are more ways and places than ever before to do that. And Jaclyn's story shows that. By the way, Jaclyn herself is a survivor of rape. And one of the things she said to me was that as a survivor, when I would see those posts, I knew it was wrong because I knew how it wounded and hurt me. And I knew posts that made light of rape or violence against women were hurting millions of other people on Facebook. My personal experience informed my political action. That's what the survivors you're hearing from today effectively have done. They've said, my personal experience is calling me to action. Some of you may know the wonderful feminist poet, Audre Lorde, and she has a quote that when I was coming up in the women's movement, I would hear often, the master's tools will never tear down the master's house. This idea that we can't leverage the same tools that those in power are using. I would argue quite the opposite, that the story of what happened at Facebook is an example that there are times when the master's tools are exactly what we need to use effectively, that we need to think about how to use media and communication, that we have to be unafraid to get in the debate. We need to use the tools ethically. We need to think through how we use the tools, but we need to stop saying we can't get in the fray. We are losing when we don't get in the fray. A few of my friends in this audience know I'm a huge fan of rock and roll and also a huge fan of rap. So spending almost 2 weeks touring Senegal and the Gambia with Sister Fa was really, for me, a highlight of my travels. She is one of the most prominent rap stars in West Africa. She actually now splits her time between Germany and West Africa. Rap in West Africa is in some ways different than rap in America. There are certainly some extraordinary rappers who are addressing political and social issues really well in this country. But in West Africa, every rapper I met, their music, their work was about social injustice. It focused on poverty. It focused on violence. It focused on the fight for truth. And she is no exception. She has written, and when she raps, her song, she has a really important body of work that uses music to educate the public on issues she's passionate about. And one of those issues is female genital cutting, what some people would call female genital mutilation. Sister Fa, is a survivor herself of female genital cutting and also childhood sexual violence. She recognized how powerful music was, and she also recognized, thanks to a remarkable community of women in Senegal, in the 90s in Senegal, to the eternal credit of this country, forced marriage and female genital cutting became illegal. They are against Senegalese law. But in some of the remote regions, especially the southern region of the country, they're not against custom, which meant that even though it was technically illegal, cutting and forced marriage and violence against women and girls was still occurring. Fatou had the inspired idea to go on a rap tour, a music tour that would draw huge audiences, to go to these regions and use not just her music, but effectively to use her soapbox to educate women and girls and communities directly on these issues. Effectively, what she said was, if the government can't fully enforce this, if there are local communities where local leaders aren't holding people accountable for violence against women, I'm going to go directly to those leaders and communities and demand they change. And she did. And going on tour with her and watching her pull out crowds of thousands of women and girls and boys and men and talk and rap in a way that gets them thinking differently about these issues, that is seeing music in a way I had never seen music before. That is her particular genius. There's a term, we're actually hearing it quite a bit in this election cycle, a very long word, disintermediation, which basically means, put much more simply, cut out the middleman or middlewoman. And her brilliance was doing exactly that. She effectively sidestepped the often male local leaders who were not communicating about changed law in Senegal and went straight to the people. Went straight to the people to create change. I think more of us can do that. I think for too often, when we've had issues, when we've wanted to change things, we've said, I'm going to my local journalist, I'm going to my policymaker, I'm going to demand that my rabbi or my pastor take this on. We have our own voices, and there are times and places we need to go straight to the people. The other thing that I learned from Fatou, that I challenge everyone in this room to think about, make your passion your activism. There is no one way to create change. When I first started working on this issue, I realized early on that communications, storytelling, that was my passion. And I could train to be a victim advocate. And I had an interest in doing that. But I had a gut sense that I could make the biggest difference doing what I'm doing today. So find your passion and let it inform your activism. Because the other great thing about that, at the risk of sounding reductive, is it makes activism fun. You actually go out into the world and you do your work, and it doesn't feel like work. And that's one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself over the course of your life, doing something you love that is actually changing the lives of other people. I want to close with sort of an umbrella theme that I've seen in all of these women and men that I've introduced you to today. And that is watching and seeing people who believe deeply in the importance of their voices, but also believe deeply in the intelligence and the importance of the people they're talking to. They believe they can create change by speaking to people's better angels, something that I think many in this room are passionate about. They are for civil disobedience. They're for protests. They're for peaceful protests. They're for changing the system. They are against, to the letter, every one of these people would say that they are against uncivil discourse. They are against name-calling. They are against hyperbole. They are against talking about personalities instead of issues. They're against vilifying the other. They're against refusing to talk to someone who doesn't agree with you. And 2 days ago, as I was preparing this talk, this was actually all set up and laid out. My technology person would note that I have the tendency to come in with a last-minute addition. And as I was preparing this talk, I found this in Rules for Radicals, and it moved me so deeply that I want to share it with you. The human spirit glows from that small inner light of doubt whether we are right, while those who believe in complete certainty that they possess the right are dark inside and darken the world outside with cruelty, pain, and injustice. Now, those words for me are effectively a guiding statement that we feel strongly. I feel very strongly about what I'm talking about here today. But I know there are people who will disagree with me in moments of this talk, and I owe it to them and myself to listen and learn from them. Finally, activism is optimism. You cannot be an activist. You will never be an activist if you don't believe in people's capacity to change. You also believe in yourself. You have confidence in your own ability to create that change. And our lives in the end, we started today talking about stories. Our lives in the end are a testimony. The lives we live, the people we love, the things we fight for, the way we treat other people, that is a form of testimony. And so we have to recognize that every single action we engage in tells a story for good or ill. I keep coming back to what Marina Nemat has said, I live to testify. And that, I think, is what every person that you met today through this slideshow would say. So I want to close with a request that you get involved. At Voices and Faces, we have something of a thesis that change is a chorus. It's not a solo. Major change never occurs with one person or in one way. And you see that when you listen to these stories, that this chorus of voices from across the globe, younger women, older women, men, women, Republicans, Democrats, people from the Middle East, Africa, everywhere you can imagine, There are individuals doing remarkable things. Together, what they're doing is to create change. So I want to ask you today, if when you leave, you can take just one of these stories and pay it forward, take it forward into your community and share it. If we can testify to what these women and men are testifying to, we can all be part of their change. We have a website I hope you'll get on to find out more, voicesandfaces.org. You can follow us on Twitter. We have a terrific hashtag campaign, hashtag the stories we tell, that's affiliated with our writing program. And of course, you can email us. And then finally, this essay is actually debuting here at the Clinton Center. I want to thank Nikolai and Skip as well, because they made this possible. I've never done this talk before, so thank you for being so wonderful and easy to talk to. But it is based on an essay that's in my book. The essay's called New Rules for Radicals, and it's in the book Live Through This, and we will be, I think, selling some of those today after the talk, and I'd love to meet you and sign a book and meet you even if I don't sign a book. So thank you very much, and you've been great.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you.
And
we got time for a couple of questions before we do a book signing. Anybody have a question? Yes.
Thank you, and I have two questions. But firstly, thank you. I learned a lot of great ideas of doing advocacy effectively. And I want to ask whether you considered or how you considered the factor of local culture and legal environment issue when you made your advocacy strategy in different locations or countries. Second question is how you deal with how to provide psychological treatment help for victims, because when they tell their stories to public again and again, they are second time hurt for what they suffered.
She's an A student, I can tell. 2 questions, good questions. An answer to your first question, I think one of the most important things we can do when we bring a program like this to a local community is really understand that community. We have to understand the mores, we have to understand the laws, we have to understand the resistance someone coming forward may meet if they come forward. And we have to talk about those things with a survivor who comes forward. I've done this talk to communities of survivors, or a talk like this with stories, and you can see that speaking out can be contagious, that when one person speaks, someone else wants to speak. But we have a moral obligation on our project. I have a moral obligation as a storyteller and a documentarian to say to someone who's considering coming forward, these are the risks to you. Let's talk about that. Let's talk really honestly about that, because this may not be the time and the place to come forward. And if it is, I want to make sure you've thought about every possible risk to you and your family. That actually dovetails with your, and then I think once you've done that, by the way, early on when I was doing this work, I would run the risk of being almost paternalistic. You know, I remember once talking to a young woman who wanted to share her story, and at some point I had kind of gone through every possible risk, and she finally said to me, Ann, I'm gonna do this, so you need to support me and get out of the way. And so there is a point where you have to honor someone's desire. But moving into your second question, our project, the Voices and Faces Project, and specifically our writing workshop, the stories we tell, we have created a program that's what we call trauma sensitive, which means that those of us who do these interviews are trained in trauma theory, that we know how to respond if someone's struggling, that we have people who are trained psychologists and counselors affiliated with our project, that we have relationships with crisis centers and hotlines, and that we recognize that when someone shares her story in the short term, she may also need support over the long term. So the most important thing is to A, be realistic about the risks, and then B, make sure you have the resources to help someone. It's really, thank you for the question. You're welcome.
Question, okay, we got a last question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a similar question to Abby's, or maybe going a little bit further. How do you deal with people, or deal sounds like the wrong word, but people who can't tell their story? And I'm thinking specifically of undocumented women who probably on their journey to the U.S. went through sexual assault. And then I'm also thinking of women in Juarez, Mexico, where the rates of femicide have increased a lot, and those women can't tell their story, and sometimes their families don't even know that that's happened to them, so their family can't tell their stories, and journalists who have tried to tell their story have lost their lives themselves or been threatened.
That's actually one of the most important questions someone could ask me. And we worked on, you may be familiar, and in fact, last time I was at the Clinton Center, I talked about the work we've done in Atenco, Mexico, with the victims of, basically victims of police brutality, torture, and violence, who are at great risk of retribution. They, in that case, chose to share their real names, faces, and stories at extraordinary risk to themselves, but that is in many ways the exception. We worked on a project not long ago with undocumented women called the Bandana Project, where women, and this was in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center, where women, undocumented women who had been victims of workplace sexual violence and sexual violence when crossing the border, shared their stories wearing bandanas over their face. Part of that was symbolic in that what they wanted to show was that in the fields and in the workplace, undocumented women very often were hiding their identity so as to avoid being victims of workplace sexual violence. But it was also a way in which they were giving testimony and having a physical presence without physically being identified. We recognize, and we have to recognize as documentarians, that there are cases and places where choosing to share one's story can effectively mean choosing to sign one's death warrant. We would never want that. We would never want to impose that on someone. My hope is that we can create ways, and we have with this project, for women to share their stories anonymously, for women to share their stories through other storytellers on the project. With the women of Atenco, one of my promises to them that I've kept is that after traveling to Atenco, and you can read a lot more about their case on the Amnesty International website, that everywhere I went, I would carry the water for their stories. So I think part of what we have to do is say, if we are in positions of strength and safety, how do we carry the water for those stories? I worked on a piece for the New Republic about this issue that I'd love to share the link. I'd love to share that link with you. But more broadly, I think we who can remain loud and verbal about this have to, because so many women and men can't.
Let's thank Ann very much for a presentation, and have the opportunity to visit with her as she signs her book, Live Through This. Ann Ream, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all.
Thank you.